Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome to another episode of the Age of Warfare podcast. I am, of course, the Totally Anxious Maximus. There is Nagate, Aidan, Colyer, and today we are going to the Ottoman Empire. We are going to the country of Turkey as we discover the medieval history of the region known as today as Turkey, back then known as Anatolia. And we're going to talk about the Janissary, perhaps one of the most important units in medieval history. So, as always, before we get started, how are you doing, Mr. Colyer?
I'm good. Because I work on a campus, our shop has weird hours when it's holidays, but it's time again, so I'm back on sensible hours. So I've got a nice pattern to my days now, so it's quite refreshing. And the weather's been a bit volatile, but it's been quite nice over here as well. So that's always fun.
We have TJ Lombardi watching. What's up, TJ? Are you doing your my stream today, TJ? Because if you are, I might be able to catch some of it after the podcast. I'm glad you're doing well, TJ. For those who don't know, TJ is an author. He writes Knit RPG, and he's working on a cool Knit RPG project called Golden Master. So I'm looking forward to that one, TJ. So thank you for watching, buddy. Even if you're just dropping in, thank you for dropping on in. So let's talk about what the Janissary was, because I know we're not talking about Roman history, so not as many people may be familiar with the Ottoman Empire. And TJ, they got Jordan Con this. That's why you got the Jordan Con event going on today in Georgia. So, but I'll be around TJ after the podcast. I'll try to catch the end of it at least. So anyway, what I was going to say is we're going to be talking about the Ottoman Empire. So the Janissary was basically, if you know the Praetorians that we were talking about last week, the Praetorian Guard in the Roman Empire, think of the Janissary as the Ottoman version of the Praetorian Guard. Yeah, they were like the elite. Basically the cream of the crop of the Turkish Empire. And because before they became the Ottoman Empire, they were known as the Seljuk Turks.
Yeah, it's one of the horse tribes. So one of the interesting things about the Turks is a lot of people labelled as Turks. It brought on a name that was similar to in the Crusades is when it came about, and it's like calling Westerners Crusaders. And there was the Frange, which came out of Franks, because a lot of the early Crusaders, like the first Crusade, was almost exclusively French, so they were Franks. So you had the nickname the Frange from obviously the other side, whereas we would call a lot of people the Turks, even though they weren't Turks. The thing about it is the Turkish tribes had a very strong martial tradition. They're military. You think of anything like, or any of the horse tribes that anyone can think of. You think about that their military function, the way that they worked. So they were used a lot at that time as well. And it became such a big thing in British history about the Turks as well. Obviously, we've got kebabs. We've got a lot of Turkish people over here, and the kebab comes from this. We'll talk about later. But the pub across the road from me that I can see out of my window is called the Turk's Head. Obviously coming from the initial fight, the fighting with the Janissaries in Vienna, and the Turks' Head, because they were fighting the Turks at the time, and that's when that pub was built as well. So there we are, a little bit of history connection outside my window.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. For those who might, I know TJ, I don't know if TJ's still watching, but I know TJ plays Age of Empires 2. And they saw that you could play as the Turkish Empire, and their unique unit is the Janissary, and it's one of the best gunpowder units in the game. And I think Age of Empires did really good. And not only Age of Empires, another game called Medieval Total War, which is the sequel. Really, I played Medieval 2 Total War. You might have played the original Medieval Total War. Yeah, they got those 2 days, those 2 video games did a wonderful job displaying how the Turks were really good with gunpowder. You know, and you know, they're like the best gunpowder civilization in the game with the best gunpowder unit. It just shows where their strength was. But the funny thing about the Janissary was that they didn't start off as a gunpowder unit. They started off as an archery unit, which Medieval 2 Total War does a good job of showing that the first Janissaries you can recruit are archers, not gunpowder. They start off as archers.
It's one of those things. It's with history, when you think about it as a unit. If you have a unit that's a set unit, it evolves throughout history. That you think, well, an archer. So you're firing. So you go from, say, look at the British military. You've gone from longbowmen, and then later on we moved to crossbows. As everyone else has moved to crossbows already, but we have our longbow thing going on. And then later on, you start giving those people guns, and then you start having your elite unit has the newest guns, and then it moves on and then into the modern military, that the newest guns, or when they change up a gun system, that you start giving it to your more elite units. Like at the moment, our military's trying to decide whether they're moving on from the classic SA-80 style weapons. In the modern incarnation of it, it's an incredibly good rifle. It has bad rap because when it was first introduced, it was poorly made. But when they moved on to the A2 design, they sorted out a lot of the problems. Basically, we went, oh, we've made a rifle, it's really good, but it doesn't do what we want it to do. So we gave it to the Germans, and they fixed it for us, because that's how you fix guns. And so you moved on, but now we're using a platform that's more like the AR platform, so more like the US military. But if you look at how that's been adopted from the Lee Enfield rifle to the SLR to the SA-80, and then onto these modern rifles, it's always your elite unit that gets them first, which is the Janissaries were the elite unit. They're an elite unit of archers. If you're going to give a unit of archers gunpowder, who are you going to give it to? Well, the elite one, hence the Janissaries. And they made really good use of it. It's like, because especially at that time with gunpowder, you had to have the unit being incredibly well trained to be able to make use of gunpowder. Otherwise, like, gunpowder was crap back then. It's like it was. You could do more with a slingshot most of the time.
Well, yeah. So going back to the Age of Empires reference, TJ, yes, he must be some AOE too. Yep. We even played a game together. Back, months ago. Obviously, the Turks, they get the gunpowder technology for free. So Age of Empires saying, yeah, the Turks are a gunpowder civilization. They're all about gunpowder. That's what the strength really lies on, gunpowder. And so it's just Mike, the developers did a wonderful job showing where the strengths are for the Turkish Empire. Although it's funny because Age of Empires calls them the Turks, although in reality they were already the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying before, where it's the Turks were sort of a catch-all for a bunch of tribes. So essentially, where you've got when you talk about the Romans and you get your horse tribes coming in, they tend to go north through what we now know as Ukraine and onto the Hungarian plain, which was really for horsemen. The Turks, essentially, and those tribes are just that succession of the same peoples, but they went south and then west through into the Middle East as well, which is why you've got so many of these obvious connections between our favourite horse archers with the Turks and obviously north. The Mongols moved that over onto the tribes that became the Russians as well. The formation of Russia. And it's really quite interesting how where you get this development of the Turkish military is actually a very similar development in the Russian military, the Strelets system. As well. And it comes up in Wikipedia. I was surprised it was mentioned in the Wikipedia article, actually. It's quite a loose connection, but it's really quite obvious when you if you know anything about either of the systems. And Cossacks, the game that we love.
The Cossacks, yes.
Has the first one, you have the Strelets in there, and that's if you play the Russians, that Strelet system. Really obvious. It also has Turkish archers as well.
And it's also home to probably the most overpowered gunpowder unit in the game, the Ukrainian Seredik. He's the most overpowered, gunpowder unit. That's why I might claim it's Ukraine. Although I don't think I told you, I don't know if I told you this, but Cossacks was developed by a Ukrainian developer. So yeah,
it's one of the reasons for it being so accurate on all of the sort of like Eastern nations.
Oh yeah, but it's also the reason why Ukraine is probably one of the most overpowered nations in the game. A little knock on Ukrainian pride, which it's cool because but Ukrainian they only have gunpowder units. They also had some of the best horse units.
Yeah, how's the mercenary light cavalry?
Yeah, the Fish Cossack. Yeah.
There's a specific type of Cossack as well.
Yeah,
the Cossack tribe. Well, see, the Cossack tribes actually this is one of the interesting things that actually goes into the Turks. Some of them are actually
right.
As well. So where we're getting this Turkish military from is exactly the same place where you're getting the Cossacks from. So it's all from that region. Obviously, the most famous Cossacks are the Don Cossacks. They're the ones that when people
think Don,
they think of the
Don River.
But obviously, you have it's one of the things if you look at it was early in the Ukrainian war that you had there were several like Chechens and essentially the southern border of Russia where you Georgia and places like that. You had these almost mercenary units, but they was part of the military. There's a whole thing about it, reading about it. But if you look at the people that are fighting in those units as well, you would swear that they were Turkish, some of those people. But it's because it's the same group of people. It's just we think of them differently when they go north to when they go south as well. But essentially, they're not that different as well. Which could explain why Turkey has a really good relationship with Russia as well, or had a really good relationship with Russia before all of the stuff happened. And it's just interesting how we think of all of these places as separate entities. And we think of Russia, we think of the west of Russia, and we think of it as a European nation to a great extent. And when it's not thought of as a European nation, that's often that propaganda to create a separation. To create separation if you're fighting against someone. Calling the Germans the Huns, for example, is exactly the same.
Yeah, right. But now, if you go to the Europe, I don't know how you pronounce it. The Ural Mountains in Russia, it becomes a whole the Urals. Yeah, it's a whole different. It's kind of a mix of Russian and kind of Mongolian. You got these little nations like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. These little smaller nations.
Yeah, Turkmenistan. There we are.
And the Tatars are Turkish. The Tatars.
Yeah, and it's those people that form the basis of the Turkish army. So to get to the Janissaries, the Janissaries, weirdly enough, were not that. As you mentioned just before we got on as well, the Janissaries were an infantry unit, and the Turks famous for their cavalry. And it's because they were very cavalry focused. One of the reasons they went for the Janissaries, because the Janissaries, after all of this conversation, weren't actually Turkish. They were in the Turkish army, but they initially were not Turkish.
They were not. Yes, correct.
They were a group of slave soldiers. Some
were slaves. Others were, like I said, the Tatars. From that particular area. I mean, even some of them, and they even had some Kumans. If you know who the Kumans are.
Yeah. So they're further east. But yeah, same group of peoples. What's interesting, you get it throughout the Middle East as well. I can't remember their name now. How I've forgotten it. But Egypt had the whole slave soldier thing where they revolted and then they took over Egypt.
Yeah, the Mamelukes.
Mamelukes.
The Mamelukes,
and so you have this sort of ethos of there's no prohibition by. Well, we think of you do have foreign units. Like if you look at the Second World War, there's obviously famous units that were formed from other countries. The SS was famous for this because it was part of their propaganda that they were doing. They had SS divisions for different areas that they'd conquered, and the people that thought in their ideology would then be put into those units. So you had SS Handschar for the Bosnians when they were holding the Balkans, and that's a weird story that we could spend about 10 episodes on. But go and look it up on I've forgotten the name of it. It's not History on Fire. It's not Dan Carling. It's History Impossible. Look up the History Impossible podcast and look up the Bosnian episodes. That explains that whole situation as well, which is incredibly interesting and is actually the follow-on situation from the Janissaries, and actually where that comes from is actually very much linked to the end of the Janissaries. But obviously the SS, there was a British division which had like 9 people in it, and that was because they got free lunches, because we are nothing but not suckers for a free lunch. And so you end up with these sort of units that are often formed out of that. There's the famous story of in the Second World War, it was a Chinese soldier captured by the Japanese, was forced to fight for the Japanese. Ended up fighting with the Japanese against the Russians. The Russians captured the Russians. The Germans captured them, forced them to fight against the Germans, and they're eventually captured on the Western Front in 1944. I think it was the Americans captured him as well. It's like, you fought in basically. I've been very surprised the Americans didn't turn around and go, "Do you want a uniform? Do you want to fight for us?" You know, just make it so you fought for everyone at this point. But yes, you do get that later on, obviously, in fairly modern history, where you get these units that are built up of foreign-born soldiers. Often they will be termed the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. They're the 2 big prominent ones that people think of at the moment in time. But even if you think about it, units that are exclusively recruited from another area, that are part of the military establishment, you have the Gurkhas. Like, our army has had them since we had that region, and people still want to join. I know the area that I live in is very close to Aldershot, and Aldershot is essentially the home of the Gurkhas in the UK. So we've got a lot of ex-Gurkhas and their families in the area. I actually work with one. He's a guy from that region, and they were stationed up at Benson, which is just north of us, for a while as well. But there's still this strong tradition of having people from foreign lands that, even if they were captured, fighting for you and being some of your best soldiers as well. This whole idea of the patriotism that we have these days is a bizarre concept. If you go back in time, patriotism is really only 1800s onwards that you really get this hardcore patriotism thing going on. Before that, it's you're part of an ideal. So you think someone like the Crusaders, things like that. Well, the Janissaries, it was the spirit de corps, I think is the term. That once they were into the Janissaries, it was all about the Janissaries. It was, they weren't protecting the Turkish monarch because they were Turkish. They were doing that because they were the Janissaries, and that's what they did. Which takes us back to exactly what we were saying about the Praetorian Guard. They were the Praetorian Guard. It wasn't that they were for the emperor. They were for Rome, but it wasn't for that. They were for that ethos of, this is what the Praetorian Guard does. This is what we do. The Janissaries, exactly the same situation going on as well. That's what they were. But yeah, it was the slavery, and it's from the Balkans as well. A lot of them were from the Balkans as well. Which, like I told you, we're going to bring up Dracula, and I'm about to get to Dracula.
Now, I wanted to share something real quick for those who don't know what a Janissary looks like. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. We got the Janissary up there. That's what a Janissary looked like. Now, this was a native Janissary towards the end of the Janissary era, but that was the traditional wear for the Janissary. You know, that's how they looked like, with the sword. Yeah, they had a sword to defend themselves whenever somebody got too close to them. That was the melee weapon. So just wanted to share that.
Which has a lot of links. So if you look at the Sikhs with the kirpan that the Sikhs have as part of the group of things that symbolise their religion, that same ethos comes out of it's the same group of people essentially. This the warrior ethos and culture, and this ideal of it, of having that blade representing who you are. And the Janissaries, obviously, that was from the Turkish ideas, obviously, that became part of the Sikh religion as well. And yeah, it's that sword is so iconic as well, which is what leads into the kebabs as well, obviously. That's the history of the kebab.
Right. And then, so now we were talking before the show that even though we do a lot of Roman stuff, this actually, and we're doing the Ottoman Empire, this is actually connects to the Roman Empire in some way, because you see the Praetorian Guards that we discussed last week, they were in charge of protecting the emperor. The Janissaries were in charge of protecting the Sultan, which was pretty much the leader of the Ottoman Empire was called the Sultan. So they basically had the same job as the Praetorian counterparts back in ancient Rome.
And when you actually look at it, if you look at when Sultan Mehmed II, when he took Constantinople.
Yep, Constantinople, right.
He obviously is famous, again, use of gunpowder, but it was obviously after the Praetorian Guard, when you get into the Eastern Empire, obviously they've got their elite units as well, the Varangian Guard, who are basically another unit of similar caliber, and they were defending the walls of the palaces. So they were then obviously replaced by the Janissaries doing the same thing, but the Janissaries fought against them as well. And it'd be interesting to see actually how the Praetorians were fared against the Janissaries. Janissaries only were formed in 13 something. They were an early 14th century unit. And obviously Praetorian Guard were long gone by then. That stage, you're well into sort of the end of the Byzantines, away from the Roman Empire. But it'd be interesting to see the Praetorians pairing up. So what was that program that was on? There was a program about this. It was, and they did like a ninja versus a pirate. And
yeah, I know what you're talking about. I just don't remember the name of the show, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I loved it so much. I referenced it in my master's dissertation. it was actually had some really, really good science in it. But it's one of those matchups that you think about. It's this elite unit at the best of the best at the height of an empire that everyone looks at and goes, "Oh, they were big." The Ottoman Empire only collapsed because of the First World War, because they were on the losing side, and with all lands, which is. A lot of the stuff in the Middle East is from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as well, which is an interesting story in and of itself. But
right.
We think, especially being in the West, we look, it's like, oh, you talk about an empire, you're either going to bring out the British Empire or the Roman Empire if you're looking for something to talk about. They're the two big empires people think about. Obviously, we know about the other ones. If you want to go a political end of things, you talk about the more esoteric US Empire, which is a different beast. But if you go back to the colonial era, obviously you've got the French Empire, the German Empire, you've got the British Empire, you've got the Dutch Empire, you've got the Spanish Empire, you've got the Portuguese Empire. We'll go through all of these. And then at the very bottom, people go, oh, yes, and there's the Ottoman Empire, because we remember them from about the same time period. But they were... It's one of the things about them being in the Middle East, and so you've got the Persian Empire, obviously. They were essentially the successors to the Persian Empire. The Turks came and they took it over, and it's that very similar thing. And they did the same to the Byzantines, because at the end, when they took over the Byzantine Empire, it was literally a city and a few towns.
Specifically, I think they were the successors to the Sassanid Empire. Remember? Yeah. The Sassanids before, although after that, the Sassanids became the Fatimid dynasty and all that. You had the different, Muslim dynasties around that area before you had the actual Ottoman Empire. And there's something I wanted to share with you and the audience here.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The actual firearms.
Which goes into the Jezzails of Afghanistan. You can still see them in Afghanistan.
Turkish guns were medicate but these were from the 1700s to the 1800s. So obviously around the time of Cossacks, Cossacks were taking place in the game, where you could hire the Janissaries.
and you can still get these. And this is what I was saying about the Persian Empire. Afghanistan was part of the Persian Empire, and I went around someone's house when I was an archaeologist early on in my career, and we were looking around, and it was someone. I think her husband had been an ambassador or something. There's an interesting story about Persia in here that I'll get to in a second. But they had one of these as well, because they still produce them. And if you look at modern AKs from the region, while it's a modern weapon, they do this to those weapons, and they look absolutely fantastic. We've got all the gold plating on it. Is that ethos, though, the concept that created the Janissaries and that ethos behind it, that military thing, is the Janissaries are the culmination of that for the Turkish peoples. That was their unit that best represents it. Hence why it's in the computer games. It best represents it. But it's very odd that the Janissaries weren't actually Turks. They were obviously later on, as you said, obviously they recruited from various different areas. But there's this big thing of them being slave soldiers. And it was, if you were defeated in war, you would give over your captives, and it would be the sons, and it would be from a very early age they were recruited in. It wasn't like in a modern military where you sort of late teens to early 20s, you join in the military and you are person of choice, or even if you're drafted, it's still the same age. But even if you go back to the 1800s, for overseas fighting, even back to the Napoleonic War, you technically had to be 19 in the UK to do that. Obviously, if you carried a drum, you could be of any age, so there was certain leeway in it. It wasn't obviously hard and fast. Whereas obviously the Janissaries was, no, they would take you from being basically a toddler, and then you would be a Janissary from that age, and you'd be taught. So they were brought up in this. That was what they knew. That was all they knew. They were a Janissary. That was it. That was their entire life, was what they were. And that's one of the biggest differences between them and, say, the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians were much more, as we think of it, of they're an elite unit, but you join to be an elite unit, or a comparison.
Right.
Yeah. Whereas these people were, no, that is what you are. You are a Janissary. It's not.
Yeah, you are. That's what you are. That's it. Period. Yeah. Aidan, I want to give you a little bonus here. I show you a Turkish firearm. Now I want to show you what a Ukrainian firearm for that time period.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Ukrainian, Foot-knock Cossack pistol. The pistols that the Ukrainian Cossacks would use to defend themselves.
And disappointingly, it's sold out. Otherwise, I'd be looking at buying.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was just more about the show than actually buying it. But
that is a really good example of what we've been talking about, of this connection between the two. Shall we move on? Right. Before this, though, that connection to the modern period, as well as one last here, I was saying about the Persians. BP, the petrol company, is known as British Petroleum, but the BP doesn't actually stand for that anymore. They changed it about a few years ago as a company name's evolved. But initially, it was set up as British and Persian Petroleum. Because Iran is Persia. And Iran is only since the 70s that it's been Iran, that it has. In the same way that Turkey has only been Turkey since it was really the movements in the late 1800s, since the early 1900s, with Ataturk and his ethos. And then obviously it was the empire was collapsing. It was known as the sick man of Europe, and it collapsed obviously after the First World War, which is why we now have Turkey as a completely different country. But this is what you were saying about the Ottomans and the Turks are kind of the same, but there's a separation there.
Right.
And Persian Iran's similar, but it's why we do get these massive connections. While the names changed, you still see these connections coming through. Like when you were showing the flintlocks, that if you look at a modern AK from around the same sort of region, right, it's a modern firearm, but the look of it, the design and the artistic aesthetic is exactly the same kind of ethos behind it as well. So and this is the big thing about us not doing something that isn't Western history, is someone from those regions who's like us, it's like the Ottomans and the Turks and the Janissaries would be the thing that they would primarily talk about, and this episode for them would be about the Roman Empire and the Praetorian Guard. It'd be the other way around as well,
Right.
because we're so steeped in the Western side of it that we don't see this as often. But the Turkish empire, so that nice bridge in between, place where it's different as well. Like as far as like history side of it, I know barely anything about Eastern history. It's like I know rough things, but if you ask me about some of the wars in China, I'd be like, they had wars and their battles had lots of people in. I could tell you about some of the Mongol stuff, but it's essentially,
the
I
only
know
thing
about the same as your average man on the street.
The thing about the Chinese, they had not internal wars, if you want to be honest. Now the internal stuff. China was a big empire, but internally it was always broken.
Yeah, it was so big they didn't need to fight other people. But it's interesting, obviously, because you got if you go to say like the Silk Road is one of the ones we know about, and it's the Turks that really controlled that as well, which is hence why they ended up with the gunpowder, because it's the trading with the Far East and the gunpowder coming across, because obviously the origins of gunpowder used in weaponry obviously are in the east, and they come west and then they get developed further in the west. And as ever, standard Roman ethos, this is really cool, we're going to nick it and make it better, which is a very common thing to find as well, where you get this transfer. Like paper money, it's the same thing. We did the same with that as well. But it's all to do with where you can find the minerals and be able to create things. Gunpowder is very basic. It's charcoal, saltpeter, and
saltpeter and sulfur.
Sulfur, that's the one. Yeah, I was about to say phosphorus, but like, you don't want to put phosphorus in your gunpowder unless you want tracer rounds, or you want to blind yourself. I know that's like some people might want to, but it's the way that they used it with the Janissaries. It's like if I truly think if the Janissaries hadn't been so successful, we wouldn't have seen the growth in gunpowder that we saw. It's a lot of that. Well, that unit's really good. We want some of those. Emulates unit. But if you didn't have the Janissaries knocking around with it, going, these firearms are really good, we're going to use them properly, then they'd have gone, well, bows, the early firearms, bows were 100% superior to early firearms. Even in the Napoleonic Wars, they were contemplating arming, like even in Britain, they were contemplating using bows instead of muskets, because they fire faster. And realistically, if you're wearing armor, your musket ball's going to do loads of damage and kill you. Well, an arrow's going to kill you just as dead. It's like there's only a certain amount of dead you can be. It's a binary proposition. You're either dead or you're not. But you can fire a bow faster. And so that transition for them using firearms must have had a big impact, because obviously if they're trained from birth with bows, that's how you get like such good longbow. Their ability to use that is because they were trained from an early age. Yet a firearm, the big thing about a firearm is anyone could be trained to use a gun. You point the bang end at the other person and pull the trigger.
Exactly.
You put the shooty bit inside, you pull the thing back to make it go bang, and then you press it, and then it goes. And it's just pointed at the other person is the idea. Whereas a bow, it's put arrow in, pull string back, let arrow fly, aim it at the other person. However, the technique to do that is a lot different, because you're putting in that mechanical bit that's inside of a firearm. It's already built into a firearm. It's like banning of crossbows, the famous historical tidbit that everyone goes for. Because they were so easy to use. It's a similar system to the firearm. Put thing in, pull thing back, press trigger, off it goes. But if you've got people that are trained really well with bows, moving them over to firearms it just showed what power they had. They're like, right, cool, this elite unit is really good. We're going to upgrade them by giving them a worse weapon. And like, you've got to have enough money and enough. You've got to have a big brass set of balls to do that to your most elite unit, realistically. Now,
you mentioned saltpeter, right? We're going to go on a little bit of a tangent, because saltpeter is actually potassium nitrite And if you compare it to table salt, sodium chloride, and some people say you can actually taste saltpeter. You can actually put it in your mouth and taste it, and it tastes like salt. But the only thing is saltpeter is actually pretty toxic to your body. But
it's one of those interesting ones. It's when you think about it, when you think about saltpeter, you just see salt, and you're like, well, I've only charcoal salt.
That's what this is what saltpeter looks like. And you compare it to table salt, so it's regular table salt.
Yeah, it's I'm not big on my chemistry. I haven't been for years. But like gunpowder's super easy to make if you've got the ingredients. You just got to get the ingredients as well. And that's but that then requires the training and the technology, and it's one of the reasons that Janissaries are able to be, like I was saying, that they're able to be armed the way they were, because the sheer amount of money that the Ottoman Empire had, it's those levels of money that, like we think of the Roman senators. Like if you translate some of the amounts of money that, like Crassus, for example, had, Crassus makes Bill Gates look like a pauper. It's like absolutely insane amounts of money. But you had to have that to be able to arm a whole unit with firearms back then. Because it wasn't like today where firearms are relatively expensive if you compare it to, say, your weekly food shop or your monthly food shop. But when you really think about it, you get a half decent rifle for about £1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Now, £1,000 is, well, if you saved up a bit of money over 2 or 3 months, you get yourself a rifle. And that's on minimum wage. You could do that these days. Back then, it'd be more equivalent to buying a house. Like you can't save that up over 2 or 3 months unless you earn a lot of money, obviously. But that's the difference between it, which is one of the reasons they look so nice, because you're going to pay that much money on it. You're going to treat it with a bit of respect.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's why people with fancy cars, the fancy cars tend to be washed very nicely all the time, because if you're paying that much money for a thing, you're going to treat it better. But yeah, think about it. How beautiful those muskets looked, and then their uniforms as well, with the big fancy hats with all the white bit on and everything like that. And obviously, we've got. Can they see our little picture? So we've got a little picture of a Janissary. And the red, even as a small picture, it's striking. It's like that.
Yeah.
Facing that across a battlefield, it's like that whole 1800s concept of the redcoats are coming, marching in lockstep with bright red coats, shiny brass buttons. That was frightening enough. Well, the Janissaries took that and then put gold leaf on their muskets. It's like, we can do that. Right. We can look good while we do it as well.
We're going to look good fighting, right?
Yeah. It's the... go on.
Now, if you play Age of Empires 2, you got it's like the early version of the Janissaries, but now, obviously, there's Age of Empires 3, which focuses on the colonial era, and they got the you got the Janissaries, the late version Janissaries with the gold, like you were saying, the gold plated, rifles and all that. So the Janissaries evolved as time went. They started off humble, and then as they grew close, so I'm like once again, Age of Empires does a good job catching how the evolution of the Janissary from Age of Empires 2, where you just had a humble white robe with an early musket, to now what we have up on the upper right corners of the screen with a musket, with a fancy musket and all that. Now, another thing I wanted to cover was the Byzantines, because we all know those who know history, the Byzantines are like basically the Eastern Roman Empire, and while the Eastern Roman Empire was very powerful, there was one thing they never made was gunpowder. As the time went. And medieval 2 total war does a good job with the Byzantines, or I would call it the Byzantines, however you want to say it. The Byzantines, they start off powerful. They got some of the best units in the game. But as you go later into the game, that they don't have any gunpowder units. The units actually become weaker. Not weaker, but you start to fall behind the times because the Turks next to you, the Turks next to you, they got gunpowder. Well, you still stuck with horse archers and the vanguard guards. While powerful, but compared to gunpowder, yeah, they're gonna go down in a couple of shots. So it kind of begs the question: what happened to the Byzantines? Why they did not embrace gunpowder? How did they fall behind the times?
It's financial. It was this. If everyone thinks the Byzantines at the height when they were so super rich with their bureaucracy being so insane that is actually a byword for a complicated bureaucracy. It's the Byzantine bureaucracy. But they were running out of money. They had spent because they didn't have the people after the plague of Justinian. And then they get their faces kicked in the Battle of Manzikert, which obviously then leads to them calling for aid from the West, and that's where we get the Crusades coming from. And their empire shrinks. They never really recover from that time period, and they try and plug the gap by hiring mercenaries. Mercenaries are expensive. They're spending all their money on the mercenaries, but they don't have enough income because they're losing people. If you don't have people, you can't tax them. So they didn't have enough income coming in. So they became a rich trading city. You're equivalent to sort of like Genoa is a good example of a place like that. And the trading ports of it's essentially the Italian trading ports.
Or Milan.
Yeah. So you've got all of these bases, and they essentially become that. Whereas obviously the Turks had that level of stuff, and they had an empire where they could get all of that money together. Is the Byzantines they could not invest that kind of money into it. And then obviously you've got your military tradition in there as well. And as I was saying, the early muskets, unless you had an insane amount of money, you're better off using bows. Like a crossbow is as easy to train and it's going to do just as much damage. And the later crossbows are just as fast. They're faster than using a musket, but they're also cheaper. It's a status symbol to have the gunpowder, and you have to have enough people, enough money to train them. Because the other thing about the Janissaries is they fit a certain role within the army. As we've talked about, they were the infantry part of it. But when you're talking about later medieval armies, you had the artillery train. And obviously it starts off with trebuchets and things like that. And we talked about the Scorpion before. So the Romans had these things. As soon as you get into the age of gunpowder, you've got to have people who know about their cannons. You've got to have people that know about the other fortifications. The Janissaries are also famous, not just for using muskets, they use grenades. They were one of the earliest units to use a lot of grenades, which when you go into, say, the Napoleonic Wars, the elite units are called grenadiers. They did use grenades, but they weren't as popular. It's only later on where you get the infantry grenades. Like First World War, they become very prominent again. But the early grenades, it was the Janissaries. So they were defending. They did all the artillery. They did all the trenches and things like that. So when you get into siege works like the taking of Constantinople, was it 1453? At that point, that's at the height of this Janissary power where they had all of that. And obviously, famously, it's because that the cannons were so well done and placed and so powerful, and they were the most powerful cannons ever produced, that they were able to knock down the walls of Justinian and break into the capital and then take it. It was the only way to really take it, unless you're a bunch of crusaders trying to make some money. But we don't talk about that. The Fourth Crusade was a bit of a mess. So you have this situation where the Byzantines just didn't have the money or resources. It'd be interesting if the Byzantines had, say, won the Battle of Manzikert. You don't have the Crusades happening if you don't have the Battle of Manzikert. And if they had enough troops and they're able to defend that means they keep a lot of those lands. You think the area around Antioch, like modern-day Syria, and obviously the coast where you've got Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, down into Jordan, and then obviously slightly further east into that, it's like you clipping the edge of Iraq almost with some of the territory. That area is incredibly wealthy, and it's the trade routes. If you control those trade routes, a lot of everyone talks about the warfare in the Middle East is all about oil. it kind of is. That's where the oil is and where the pipelines are. But back then, it was the same. It was the trade route from the east, which is where you get your gunpowder from, where you get your silk from, where you get your luxury goods that you can then luxury goods sell for more money. You can get a better trade thing, which is why you get these impressive cities all along various different names for it, but essentially on that coast on the east of the Mediterranean. If the Byzantines had kept that, the Varangian Guard would have ended up with muskets. That would be that's an interesting what if history. The Byzantine Empire ending up being staying around. Because if they'd have stayed around, then they'd have been like the Ottomans, part of the First World War as well. Because obviously the Janissaries were dissolved by then, became part of the wider Turkish military, but you have this sort of ethos behind it going forward. So imagine the elite unit of the Byzantine military, of Varangian Guard, fighting in the trenches of the First World War. That'd be a hell of a story that I might write. Right. I'm not writing other things, but it's that control of that area, realistically, and having the control of those trade routes that gave them that money. And obviously, we think of it as controlling that area. They had vast lands further east. It's like all the way up to India. They controlled. It wasn't as if they could just control that little bit that we consider in our European perspectives. That area of land was huge, bigger than the Roman, way bigger than the Roman Empire, as well. So that was the funny thing about the Persian Empire. It was bigger than the Roman Empire. It's just there were lots of things you couldn't live in, whereas most of the Roman Empire you could live in it. So apart from a lot of North African areas, obviously. So you end up with their ability to do this, but as soon as they get into the Balkans with the denser populations in the Balkans, as well, once you get through that Anatolian region as well, then you can recruit for the Janissaries. And now I get to talk about Dracula because I keep doing it and I keep getting it. So the story of Dracula, as everyone knows, it's like the whole Vlad the Impaler story. So he was I'm going to get this wrong now. Was he Hungarian or Bulgarian?
I think Hungarian. I believe.
Hungarian.
Yeah, I think it's Hungarian.
So it makes sense. Hungarian plain. He's the descendant, essentially, of those horse tribes of the early Byzantine Empire. The collapse of the West. You then get a lot of the horse tribes that end up settled, where the Byzantines just don't have the forces or the money to stop them coming in. So they settle them inside. Exactly the same thing that happened in the West with the settlement of the Saxons to fight against the other Germanic peoples. So you end up with those groups of people there, and they still keep this military ethos. Because one of the things, obviously, the Romans did was you let those people in on the principle that they then fought for you against the other people to stop the other people getting in. If you look at this martial tradition, that if you follow through the Byzantine military ranks and the formations of them, like one of the ones that I find the funniest is the title of vicar. You say vicar to anyone nowadays, you're like, well, that's the priest in the local church. Or actually, vicar comes from vicarius, spelled like vicarious, and it was a Byzantine rank of a noble, and they would control the military. It was a leader, and was linked to the land, which is why vicar, which is the same way that the church is constructed. Weird connection, but is interesting nonetheless. So Dracula he comes from this sort of this early feudal nobility type of thing coming through. And obviously his story is set as starting in the late 1400s, after the collapse of the Byzantines, when the Turks are taking these lands and forming the Janissaries. And if you actually look into the history of it, I can't remember which Dracula film it is. It's one of the Dracula Origins films. It shows it really well. Obviously, you've got the horror aspect of it, of being a vampire and everything. And it's like the whole Vlad the Impaler. Impaling people was no different to crucifying people. It's just as horrific. It was just that he did it more, which is why he was known for doing it. But the Turks did it as well. The people he was fighting were the Turks. The people he was trying to stop them recruiting were the sons of all the other nobles, who were the Janissaries. And it actually comes up in the film as well. So actually the history of Dracula and our most famous horror character that we have in Western mythology if the Janissaries hadn't have existed, we wouldn't have Dracula. You really think about it, because the whole horror stories are basically the propaganda that built up around how he fought the Janissaries, or tried to stop the Janissaries, as it were, because he was fighting the Turks in general. But it's quite interesting that you got this this link of a very European type of link with the Janissaries. Like I keep saying, is this bridge between what we think of in the West and what we think of as the East, and the Turks were both, which was obviously where we get the Janissaries from, which is no wonder we emulated them.
Yep. It's interesting, right? When we're talking about the Byzantine Empire, you can kind of say they fell the same way their Western Roman Empire counterpart fell, only 1,000 years later.
Yeah, it was. Well, carry on doing the same thing; it's going to have the same consequences, really.
Yeah, it's like they never learned from their cousins in the Western Roman Empire. They end up doing the same thing, only instead of the Vandals, it was the Ottomans.
Yeah. And
it's funny how history works.
Why did they lose all of their money? Because they lost the provinces of the Middle East, which is where the money came from for the trade.
Yes.
It's exactly the same thing over and over and over again.
Over and over, yeah. It's like they say, history repeats itself, and it sure did here. There was one more thing I wanted to touch on, and that was the dissolution. How did the Ottoman Empire fall? The Janissaries are dissolved. Because eventually the Janissaries did dissolve.
It was, because it's vaguely know about it. It was essentially because they were defeated too many times.
Actually, it was more like revolts. There were now Janissary revolts later on in the Ottoman Empire, and so about 1838. All Ottoman fighting corps were included in the army, and changes made to the order troops in 1838. That's when they went from the Janissaries to just the order troops.
Yeah, here we are. So I'm just looking it up on Wikipedia because I know some of this, but I just don't know all of it. Oh, here we are, Bosnian Serbs. Grand Viziers, Bosnian Serbs, bunch of sultans, people getting kicked off the throne. It's the same old story over and over again.
Yeah, same story as the Praetorians. Yeah, how you like that?
The same. Yeah, they kicked up too much of a fuss, and they went, "Yeah, let's just get rid of them. They're a bit too awkward to have around anymore." But then it's that thing. If you recruit from primarily from your defeated enemies, and you fill up an elite military unit with them, and you start giving them power. What do you expect, really? They're gonna take over at some point.
It's like playing Civilization. It's like when you take over an enemy city, you're gonna start off with a whole amount of pissed off people because hey, you just conquered us. You just stinking conquered us. So and you want us to join your army? You want us to fight for you? Yeah, after you conquered us. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. For me, that might have been the biggest. That may have been the biggest weakness of the Janissaries, despite it lasting much longer than the Praetorians even lasted. They lasted over close to 500 years.
Praetorians lasted longer because they were around in the Republic.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. But
it's not much longer though when you think.
Not much, but you get the idea. They lasted longer than they had any right to last.
Yeah. And it's got to be partly down to that indoctrination of that training them from so young that that's who they were. It's if you put people in who have known another life, then they'll always think about that other life that they could have had, and if they've got power, they may want that back, or they want to change things so other people don't get captured. Whereas if indoctrinated from a child, if you look at any group of indoctrinated people, like cults are always a really good go-to for this. If you look at people, say the branches of some of the US religions, when you get sort of fairly like strongly hyper-religious Christian group that's a small breakaway, say, from started off as Baptist and then became a something Baptist and then became a something area Baptist, and then some weird quirk came up, and then you end up with just one small church that then ends up, it doesn't take very long for someone to turn up and make it into a very closed cult-like situation. And as soon as you go past one generation, you've got children that are brought up like they don't know anything different. That is just what they think is the core of things. It's a broader topic would be, say, for example, racism. A lot of racism, when you look at old people, like, oh, that old person's racist. Yeah, that's because that was the norm. That's just what everyone thought back then, and that's how they were brought up. It's very difficult for them to think in a different way. Whereas people like us are brought up knowing that, well, this is wrong, so it's then a choice to do that. Whereas obviously, when you go to something like the Janissaries, they're brought up, this is always what it is. You are part of this, you're a tribute. And because a lot of them were, you get it a lot across the whole of the medieval period of you give your son to be raised by the person that defeated you as assurance that you're not going to go to war with them again.
Right.
So you end up with these connections. It also prevents further wars because you've got that connection. You don't want to fight people. Game of Thrones does it perfectly
Right.
as well. You look at that, the whole start of that thing is all about that having a son who was taken from someone else after a war was won, was brought up with them, and it prevents another war happening. And it's only when that cycle gets broken that you end up with this. The Janissaries, the same thing. When that cycle then gets broken later on, is when you end up, as you say, they just turn into the Praetorians, and then they start deciding who the Sultan is, and then they start palace intrigue and everything like that. And you got to think a lot of the people, once the Ottoman Turks take the Byzantine Empire and the capital, they didn't kill everyone.
Right.
Those people then became the Turks. And if you've got a bunch of people that know how to run that city, you just change it. It's like if you have a company that takes over your company, yeah, they will lay off certain people, they will move around some of the management, but realistically, 90% of that company is still the same people, just wearing a different uniform.
Right.
Yeah, it's that type of thing. So you've got all of this complicated Byzantine bureaucracy and how they did things that was left in place. And with that intrigue, you throw in a bunch of Janissaries into that intrigue, you're going to end up going the same way as the Byzantine Empire, which they did. And it's one of the reasons for the later troubles that the Ottoman Empire had before, obviously, defeated in the First World War. And it was 1922, I think, it was the Treaty of 1922 after Versailles. There was a whole bunch of other ones. I can't remember the name of it now. But yeah, which was ended up being the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which is then when you get the protectorates in the Middle East, which then leads to a lot of the issues that we have now. And also it's interesting if you look at, say, the conflict, the Israel-Palestine, and they're all about who owns the land. A lot of that paperwork of proving who owned the land, and actually a lot of the issues over who owns the land, come from the later Ottoman Empire, where they had people from the Central Empire trying to make money by going to the illiterate peasants and buying the land off them for super cheap. Like your big corporate people that go and buy the farmer's land and build a bunch of condos in the US. It's exactly the same situation that you always get. But having seen some of the pictures of the paperwork, it is that later paperwork style of the Ottomans where a lot of this stuff comes from. So it would have been the people protecting those people doing that paperwork would have been the Janissaries. They would have been the later Janissaries, or obviously the later documents as well. Obviously, after the Janissaries were disbanded, those Janissaries are still around. They just become another part of the military as well. They just become another elite unit within the whole thing. So it's an incredibly fascinating group. It's like, so obviously you've got the Mamluks is the only other group of people I can think of that were essentially a slave military. And obviously they ended in the same way. They killed off a sultan and took a country. And they ended up ruling the country though. The Janissaries didn't manage that one. Well, neither did the Praetorians either, actually, come to think of it.
Yep. Can you believe it, Aidan? we have reached the end of the show. Yeah, it's already been an hour gone by. But yeah, it's been another interesting, wonderful topic. Going to the Ottoman Empire, and we were able to connect the dots between them and the Roman Empire. But our war is
One
another great
last thing
show.
here is I listened to it it was quite a while ago. I don't know if it's still around. There was a podcast on the history of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of stuff that's later on, but it goes into cultural things. They had some episodes on the music as well, and various different cultural things as well, which was really, really interesting because they did a lot of connections to the West as well, similar to what we were doing here. So if people are into podcasts and want to follow up on what you're talking about, that's one that I would highly recommend that people go and listen to.
Yep. And before we go, I just want to do a little bit of a self promo about our charity horror anthology that me and Aidan and many others are working on. I am going to be working on my story starting Monday. I'm going to be working on the story for that anthology. So it's going to be in the Minoan Empire. It's going to be loosely based on King Minos. So I already got it planned out. So I'm gonna do a short story there, and I think Aidan, you were doing something in the medieval times, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the very early bit of the Crusades, just after the Crusader States were formed. So I do have Turkish horse archers appear within the first 1,000 words.
Cool.
So,
excellent. So obviously, we're aiming for sometime in August to release that anthology. So we're working on our stories right now. So I can't wait. It's all for a good cause. It's all for I believe Lee's daughter. Lee Edwards' daughter. So it's all So yeah, it's gonna be it's for a wonderful cause, and when we get more details when it releases, we'll let you know. But so that's what we're going to be working on this week. I guess me and Aidan are going to be working on our stories for that anthology. But really, I think that's going to be it, guys. Before we go, Aidan, let people know where they could find you.
Yeah, the same place as usual. AC Cartography on Drive-Thru-RPG, and then if you stick my name into Facebook, you'll find my author and my maps page. Obviously, I don't post in them very much, but with the more that we're doing with the anthology and the closer we're getting to the time, I'll start using my author page again. So that's one of the places you can go to find out about the anthology. There, and me, obviously.
For me, you can find me on Amazon and Angel Ramon or Angelus Maximus for my historical fiction stuff. You can also find me on Facebook, The Written Undead. You can find me on the Niches of Angelus Maximus. I'm going to start posting there a little more often now that I've recharged myself. And just find me on Facebook, where it's the best place you can find me. Well, guys, that was another wonderful episode of the Age of Warfare podcast. So for Centurion Angelus Maximus and the Gate, Aidan Colyer, we'll see you next time, ladies and gentlemen. Until then, have a great weekend and be safe. Take it easy, guys.